I am a part of the Student Union Assembly, which is the campus-wide student government. I serve as the Commissioner of Diversity. So as some of you know, the reason why we're here, so a lot of the resource centers have been going through some changes, and there's been a lot of sentiments, uncertainties of going around campus as to what exactly these changes are, why are these changes happening, how will they impact the service to our community. So I, alongside the research center directors, Pablo and Alma, the dean of students, worked to put this town hall together in hopes of providing a space for students to get informed, to express any concerns or questions they may have, and to continue to dialogue about next steps. So we hope that this is just the beginning of a longer conversation and further action that we may take. So I want to pass it on to
Carolina and Lucio. So good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. Just want to go ahead and very quickly point and wave, have the other directors say hello. I'm Carolyn Dunn. I'm the director of the American Indian Resource Center, and as part of the reorganization of the Resource Centers, the managing director of the Resource Centers cluster. Pablo Reguerin, the executive director of Retention Services, under which the Resource Centers are a part of, and also the director of EOP. And Pablo's going to talk a little bit. Rosie Cabrera, everyone knows Rosie, director of El Centro, the Chicano Latino Resource Center. Nancy Kim, director of the Asian American Pacific Islander Resource Center. Dr. Marla White-Hall, director of the African American Resource and Cultural Center. Ms. Stephanie Milton, director of the Women's Center. Ms. Deb Abbott, the director of the Lionel Cantu Queer Center. So Tam is here. Where's Tam?
Just stepped out the door.
Tam Welch, the program coordinator, acting program coordinator for both Cantu and for APIRG right now. Kristen Weaver is also here, who is one of the program directors in the cluster for the Women's Resource Center. And I think that's everybody who is part of the Resource Center cluster. Most of you are all interns or involved in some way with the Resource Centers, and so thank you all for coming. So what the structure is going to be tonight is that we do have a handout, and we'll be referencing the handout, but this is just to give you information as to what's happening, where we're at right now. The first part of the handout is the memo of understanding that was signed between Alma Cifuentes, and Alma was not able to make it this evening. She actually has the flu, kind of that horrible grossness that's going around that everybody has, and so she sends her regrets that she is unable to be here. But again, as Rocio said, this is an ongoing conversation that we hope to continue, and Alma is a part of that, even though she's not here, and will continue to be a part of that. So Pablo and I are representing her. So anyhow, so this was a memo dated June 30th, 2010, which is a memo of understanding between Alma and between the former SUA chair and the SUA Commissioner of Diversity in terms of discussing the beginnings of the reorganizations for the resource centers. And then also where we have now on the second page of the handout is an organizational chart of where we're heading. And then I also have an organizational chart of where we were, and I'll put that up when Pablo's talking, so you can see where we were and this is where we're heading. And then we're going to have discussion as to why this needed to take place to move from that to this, and have that discussion. And then I'm going to turn it over to Pablo, because you're going to discuss a little bit more of that and talk about what we're doing. So what we're doing, kind of getting some questions to begin with, then talking about the reorganization, and then putting it back to everybody else to be able to ask the questions that you may have that may not have been answered during our presentation.
Okay. Hello again, my name is Pablo Reguerin. As Carolyn mentioned, I'm also here representing Alma Cifuentes, our Dean of Students. She's really sorry she couldn't be here. One of the messages Alma asked me to convey is that making our campus inclusive and making sure that we are serving all students is really important. It's been at the core of her work in terms of her role as Dean of Students. Our Executive Vice Chancellor is also very committed to making sure that all students are succeeding. And so I think for all of our work, as we look at this, what we're doing with resource centers as well as overall, that we remain very committed to the inclusion and making sure that everybody is successful in terms of their outcomes, and making sure that we have strive for as much educational equity as possible for all students. What I thought we would do to get started, because this has been a process unfolding over multiple years, and there's some policy issues, some budgetary issues, student input points. But I thought, rather than just telling the story, which I think would be what we want to do is lay some context. But even before we do that, I think what we wanted to do is get a sense for those of you that are here, and first of all, thank you for coming tonight. What you want to make sure you understand better by the time that we're done with this meeting. And I'm going to jot down some notes and ask Carolyn to help me remember what issues are. So before we get into it, so that we can kind of target our story and emphasize other parts more than others, so that I think what we want to do is give a snapshot and then have a discussion. So I guess I want to hear from you all that are here, that may come to be here. What do you want to make sure you understand, whether it's a very specific or a broad topic that you want to make sure we cover before we get into the discussion?
So just to give a little bit of background, the image that's up on the screen right now is the former structure of the resource centers. And so you'll see that there are the managing director, which I'm 50% time managing director, and then 50% time director of the AIRC. And then in the AIRC, so we had, so previously, as many of you know, we had one director per center and one program coordinator per center. So you can see the old structure here with everybody's classification. I'm not sure if everybody needs to know that, but that's just what the classifications are between the director and the coordinator position. And so this is when we put the resource centers all together under one unit. This is how it ended up looking. So there's the larger resource centers, then there's the individual centers with the individual directors, and then each individual center had a program coordinator assigned. Each of these program coordinators may not have been assigned 100% of the time. Some were 75%, some were brought up to almost 100, some were at 90, so it just varied in terms of where the program coordinators were. The directors were 100% of the time. So that's just a little bit of background information for the former structure.
I think the other thing to mention is that they didn't all start at the same time in terms of our campus history. In fact, I might invite some of the other directors who know the past a little bit better. But so they came in at different points in time. And I think when they really got more established, when there was a larger funding base, was when Measure 7 passed. I think that was kind of an initial point. I don't know which was the first center to get started. Was it? I suspected. Was the Women's Center initially, or was it always housed out of Student Affairs? You know?
Yes.
Yeah. And then following, the next one was the African American Resource Center, and then there was kind of no resource centers established for a few years, and then pre Measure 7 though there were some efforts that started.
95.
Okay, so then Central started.
Can2 in 97.
Oh, yeah, 97, April in 99.
Okay.
AIRC was 2001.
Okay, and that's 97 was when no, right, but when Measure 7 was passed. Was it around 97?
No, Measure 7 was after, in the 2000s.
Okay, early 2000s.
Yeah, early 2000s.
So part of the reason why there were different staffing levels, that they'd come in with different funding pots initially, but just to give some context. Before we get started in kind of telling the story, does anyone have any particular areas they want to make sure we address, or maybe lay some context and then engage in more of a discussion? Just want to make sure that, I don't miss anything in telling the story. Yes?
How there will be continuation of services to students, given that the program coordinator position has been eliminated.
Okay, all right. Any others? Yes? Oh, here and here.
Along the same
Rosie, you
lines,
said you're jotting it down? Sorry?
it's okay. Along the same lines, I'd like to understand what the difference is between how we saw the program coordinator job position and then now the proposed program specialist job position.
Okay.
What those differences would be.
Okay, definitely. Talk to them And then what we'll do is before we engage in the discussion, we'll just go back to the list to see, kind of check them off as we cover them. But we can certainly have more discussion if after you hear get some context, and you might be better informed to ask more questions. But I just wanted to check before we started. Okay. All right. So I began my role. I'm going to be starting my 4th year now. So in September of 2009 is when I came in. And I do want to say other units are also going through restructuring processes, and this is something that is happening on the campus overall. And generally, different things can start a restructuring process. It can be performance-based or a change of service. A new service is going to be offered. It can be budget-driven. And so there can be a lot of different reasons in terms of why a restructuring process starts. One of the first things to isolate in a restructuring process, in terms of the process at UCSC, is to figure out what are the core functions of what we're trying to deliver. Kind of what are our business needs, and then once those are identified, then you take a look at saying, okay, what kind of budget do we have? What kind of team do we need to implement the objectives or the business needs that we want to carry out? And so the process that we've been using all along, which is consistent across the campus, is that you take a look at your organization and say, okay, are we, delivering our mission? Are we looking at what we want to do? In most cases, there's definitely budgetary issues that are driving that. But defining the core issues becomes really important because it drives everything else. Really, I think the initial discussions around restructuring the resource centers started kind of from a few different areas. One was budgetary. That the research centers were funded from a pot of money that came from a student referendum that students decided to tax themselves. And the way that Measure 7, the language was written, it did not include what's called CPI, and I forget what it stands for, but it has to do with an adjustment for inflation every year that goes up. So it was a base amount of money, and I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. I don't know. Do you know what it is per student per quarter? Or what I want to say it's like $6, around $6 per student per quarter.
It's $1.50 a quarter, I believe.
For Measure 7? No, I think it's
Measure 7?
definitely higher than that. But I think it's more around $6. But in the list of fees that you have, you'll see one that says Measure 7, and we can even show it online what the original language was. But really, students voted because at that time there were budget cuts. And wanted to preserve and make sure there was a co-curricular experience offered for students. And Measure 7 funding, there's a list of eligible units. Not everybody on the list got money, but the resource centers weren't area. And so the bulk of the budget really comes from this fund. And while while the pot of money does not go up, the costs around running the resource centers increase because of inflation. And so initially, as staff were getting hired on, and as the pot of money came in, the first few years, the costs were manageable. So it was getting ramped up, getting started up, and as over time, what's happened is the cost for the staffing has increased. So you have for example, if you have reoccurring costs that are going up, but your budget is staying flat, you end up putting pressure. So the budget is split into two areas. One is staffing, salary, and the other is non-salary. So that's like your program expenses come from. The program expenses have stayed relatively flat, but the staffing costs, without adding more positions, have gone up because of an increase in retirement costs, in benefits costs. Also, every time there's what we call a cost of living, or there's been a merit, if you're funded, generally if you're funded somewhere where you do have an adjustment for inflation, when there's an increase, let's say a 3% cost of living adjustment, we call them merits here, the staff get a bump in their salary. But there's no additional budget to cover that. So what ends up happening is your budget, you have to scoop into your non-salary money to move it up to the salary line. And you can only do that for so long before you basically run out of programming money to use. And so that issue that was identified very early on was called the Measure 7 leakage issue, which grows over time. And so they're definitely, so we knew about it for quite some time. You could predict that if we didn't do something, pass another measure, make some kind of change, you would eventually go into deficit. And again, in the early years, I'm sure there was carry forward because you were just getting started up. You can use your carry forward to offset if you have a deficit over time, but eventually that runs out. And carry forward is just simply at the end of the fiscal year, once you've if you have less expenses than what you had budget, you have money left over. It's like the surplus. But you don't get that surplus every year. You just get your permanent budget. So we knew we were facing this Measure 7 leakage issue, not just in the resource centers, but across all the units that receive Measure 7 funding. But I don't think any other area, whether it's health services, OPERS, EOP, some of the other areas are not as dependent on Measure 7 money. So they have a mix of funding and a little bit of Measure 7, whereas in the resource centers, it's probably 90% Measure 7 funded. There's some gift funds, there was some state funding, but over time the state funding has gone down, and there's been more reliance on Measure 7. I think even originally in the Measure 7 language, the students were providing this funding as a supplement. So the idea was, we're going to supplement funding that the university is providing to make sure we keep services, expand more services, and not reduce them. But what's happened over time is the state budget has gone down, there's been more reliance, so the supplemental money becomes kind of like the money that you're living on. So that kind of budget pressure was one issue. The other issue why we thought it was important to take a look at the resource centers really came up from discussions and requests from students. One of the issues was around performance. There was, and this is 3 years ago, about 3 years ago, 3 to 4 years ago, we had some positions filled, some positions unfilled in terms of the director positions, but there was a difference in performance. So some centers offered something every week, some centers offered something once a quarter, and the students were just saying, well, why is there so much variance, so much difference amongst performance? And I think there's always been an issue that comes up every so often. Well, how do we get more resource centers? Like, what do we do, let's say, for a community that's not represented amongst the current group? Why only these groups? Why don't we have, let's say, Middle Eastern Resource Center? And so there were definitely some issues that would come up in discussions with students over time. But I think the main issue is we're trying to address the budget pressure issue and say, okay, let's take a look at ourselves as a group and kind of evolve the work and look at our model. So I think the Dean of Students office kind of launched it by saying, okay, kind of framing the issue and the problem, saying we have this leakage issue that if we don't address down the line is going to affect our budgets and we're going to go into deficit. I think we started with a staff retreat. We had a couple staff retreats, and we started off by trying to come up with a different organizational model that would cost out. And at the time, we had also a lot of people there was a lot of turnover in the program coordinator position. This was earlier on. This didn't happen in the last couple of years, but prior. I know I met with the program coordinators, and there was concern that the SAO1 level position was too low classified, and because it was furloughed in most cases, meaning they had to take the summers off, and because it was 0.52, it ranged from 0.52 to 0.92, I think was the highest. It wasn't really a livable wage. We also had issues of high staff accruals, and so if you work, after you work your appointment time, you have to pay that out, or you accrue what's called comp time. So we were trying to address the kind of what I'll call the liabilities in terms of the budget. It clearly was an issue where we had growing expenses and not a growing budget. And so we started off with a retreat. We looked at some models. The directors proposed some models. Not all of them necessarily costed out. I know there wasn't full agreement on one single model. I think there was definitely more support for one of the models, some of the models than others. I think over the past 3 years, we've probably had at least 15 different organizational designs that we've looked at. We also looked a little externally. Nancy and I went to a meeting at the University of Washington, and we met with the University of Arizona, University of Washington, University of Colorado, and I think those were the main ones. UC Berkeley didn't go, but subsequently I did a visit to UC Berkeley also to see, kind of look at their models. I know at the time we were doing this, we scanned all the org charts for all the UC campuses to see where they fit, what office they were under, and how they work. And in doing the research, we kind of discovered two main models. There's what's called the self-contained model, which is where there's one resource center, generally one director or one coordinator, some student staff, and then there were multicultural centers. That was generally one director and then staff representing different groups. I think Berkeley is the only campus that has a multicultural center and then has the different models. And the center is more of a physical space. So we looked at some of these different models in discussion, and we've been working with SUA, with the Commissioner of Diversity was on one of our work teams, Leda, a few years back. We also, as we were doing that research, we also launched a student consultation process. And so what we did was we came up with kind of an instrument, a list of questions, basically asking students like, what do you value most out of the resource centers? What's most important to you? And then each resource center held a focus group. Some of it was with their interns, using the same instrument, so a common instrument, everybody used it, and then we pulled those back, and we kind of synthesized the things that people had requested the most. And I'll read out what those were, because this is our drivers for the organizational planning. Just to go back to looking at the different campuses, I think in the conversations, we never felt that a multicultural center model would work on our campus, or that the students were not interested, at the time in that notion. There also was some discussion around having more programming around points of intersection. So, let's say being gay and Latino, or female and African American, doing a little bit more work also around students of mixed heritage. That was one of the things that came up. And so we did the student consultation process, we looked at some of the different models, and kind of then isolated kind of what rose to the top of the following functions. So that whatever new organization we developed, we were trying to achieve the following outcomes. That each resource center play a connector function for students to campus resources, and that it was going to be broad. In some cases it was enrichment, like here's or TLBTI studies, playing a connector role in that function, doing some crisis work, as well as general advising of students. And so the connector function was really important. Students said, this is one of the things I really value. Like, I wouldn't have known about these other things if I hadn't learned about it at a centro, etc. Provide a safe space and address issues of cultural isolation. Essentially, what the way it was described by a lot of the students was a home to be yourself, like somewhere where I can just go in and be myself. A safety net for services including mental health support, HIV testing, health functions, and ability to connect with appropriate resources. Identity development, and I think that was particularly with the students who were doing internships or worked at the centers that spent more time. So the ability to be able to explore your identity as a Latino, as and whatever identity we're looking at. Student leadership and professional development opportunities. So a lot of the students who did events said, I gained a lot of practical skills that were really marketable, and I learned things that complemented the theory or what I learned in the classroom. Advocacy and training. So this is one of the things that I think this came more from the staff. It might have even come more from Alma and myself. But it was the notion around basically that aside from serving students coming in, there was a role for the resource center to be educators on the campus and to work with units. So instead of solely doing the work one student at a time, many of them were already engaged in working with, like Deb, for example, working with the health center on working with transgendered students. So we were changing systems on the campus in addition to working one student attempt to make the campus more inclusive. So if a unit was having a hard time recruiting Latino students, they would consult with Rosie. And so this notion of them also playing kind of an educator role, or an advocacy role. The other thing that was really important to the students in the feedback we got was presence of the staff is really critical, and being available to deal with student drop-ins. A lot of the students wanted to, when they came in, they wanted to talk to the director, they wanted to talk to somebody to deal with whatever it is that they were dealing with. So presence of staff that came up quite a bit. And then the other one was around effective and increased collaboration across resource centers, producing programs that address the complexity of student identity. So to go beyond just one particular experience. I think the other work, so that's kind of what came up from the feedback as well as some input from the staff. And those have been the core drivers that we've been trying to deal with within the constraints of the budget, but still trying to address. And the reason that's important in a restructuring process is it's after you've made your changes, you kind of go, this is your checklist to go back. Did the way that we redesigned this, are we better equipped to address these issues? The other things that were just working assumptions were that we try to produce as much equity amongst the centers, not just in terms of FTE, a dollar amount in resources, but in performance. That there would be no base budget cuts applied because Measure 7 was not part of the state budget cut process. And that we had to address the current and future increased costs. So even though both result in less money for the center to operate, there's a difference between the two. A base budget cut is when the EDC, for example, says, or the chancellor says, you need to cut 3% from your budgets, figure out what units, and then they come and they scoop the money. That's a base budget cut. And we've never applied a base budget cut. That's a permanent base budget cut with the resource centers. But if you have rising costs, then you have less money to use. So bottom line is the effect is still the same, but they're two very different things. And the reason it's important policy-wise is because you can't apply a state budget cut or to a student referendum. They're two different pots of money. No newly created administrative management positions that if we were going to have, we couldn't like create a director for the resource centers, for example, that only did that the administrative positions, we were going to try to keep at a minimum. To maximize the resources across the centers and partners, and then again, addressing the structural issues. So those are some of the other working assumptions that we came up with. I think at the time, the resource center directors were reporting directly to Alma, so some of this happened just before I arrived. She had 15, so they were reporting to the Dean of Students. There were 15 total reports to Alma's area, and so she restructured the area. We created the managing director position, not by creating a new position, but by modifying the American Indian Resource Center director position. And that's when we did the recruitment for Carolyn's position. The second phase of the restructuring was to deal with the increased costs. One of the things that we agreed to with the staff when we realized if you have payroll-driven budget pressure, it wasn't going to be like, oh, if we all do 2 less programs, we're going to solve the issue. You can only address payroll-driven cuts by addressing payroll. And so the other issue was that even though the payroll affects professional staff positions, it does not affect student employment. So those student positions don't affect. It's payroll from permanent FTE provisions on the books. So we, in the course of our conversation and after looking at different scenarios, we did eliminate the program coordinator position. It was not something anybody wanted to do, but the trade-off was, and let me say what we decided we felt was important. One was we were committed to not going into a multicultural center model. That we would preserve each director for each area, and we would try to preserve, I think everybody was in agreement that there should be more programming around points of intersection, but that we wanted to preserve the kind of autonomy and the ability for the director to develop culturally relevant, linguistically appropriate, programming, and that piece was really the core piece. So then what we also too were, was more of a secondary issue. We have had a work-study crisis too on our campus with people getting a work-study allocation, not being able to find a job. So we did feel that if we could, in this restructuring, create more student positions, that was one of the other goals that we had as well. So we then went to the implementation, moving into this next round, and we have started to put well, I'm sorry, let me go backwards. We can put up now the organizational chart. So let me show you what we came up with, what did cost out, and I want to clarify that the way that the amount of in order to avoid the budget cuts, basically our goal was we had to reduce payroll. And so the question was, how can we reduce the payroll enough to preserve the services and have as high quality service as possible, without diluting what we're doing, but avoiding budget cuts. The other thing too that was affecting our budgets is before, when the Student Affairs Division existed, whenever we had increased costs due to benefits, we didn't see it at the Resource Center level because the divisional office would pay it. And so even though we had a leakage issue, we never really had to deal with it because the divisional office would kind of bring us back to zero each year. Once we lost the Division of Student Affairs, we lost the ability to control those benefits costs. And so what ended up happening is the leakage just grew rapidly because nobody was washing it at the end of the year. So that, I don't want to say that this is as a result of not having a Division of Student Affairs, but definitely we basically added another pressure by anytime we had somebody who was temporarily hired or on a temporary assignment, we had to pay 30% about 30% on top of the salary, which in the past we never had to do. So it's essentially a situation where you have rising costs, no increase in budget, and those costs driven to payroll. And that's really what led us to having to rethink the process. So the other piece too that I would say from looking at we were real clearly, we were committed to keeping the self-contained model. But one of the things we noticed, and I noticed looking at the multicultural center models, they were definitely much more efficient. So one person, let's say, did the website. There wasn't trying to reduce the duplication and administrative costs. Multicultural center models, it's not the answer, but they're highly efficient. And so what I was trying to pose is, how can we gain the efficiency of a multicultural center model, but keep the self-contained model, kind of like a best of both worlds approach. And all the campuses we scanned, they either have one or the other. And some campuses, like for example, University of Arizona had self-contained models, then they went to a multicultural center model, and then they went back to a self-contained model. And I think what we were striving for is, we've never had in the works to do a multicultural center model, but we did say we want to figure out how to make it more efficient. And so operationally, they're going to be more independent. So they're self-contained with respect to the autonomy, the decisions of the programmings, working with students, but we're going to try to consolidate where we can without affecting their ability to program for their particular communities, and try to reduce the overhead, the administrative costs of the duplication. So we basically developed 2 program specialist positions, and right now we're working with staff HR to finalize the job description so we can go out for recruitment. This is where we've been struggling a little bit with SEO3 level positions. SEO3s are positions that people are exempt. So below previously the program coordinator position has been an hourly position. So it doesn't lend itself very well to weekend and evening programs. And as you guys know, a lot of the action happens in the evenings on the weekends. And you end up accruing a lot of overtime as well. So the other thing is that you pay benefits. So for every FTE you have, once you hit 50%, you pay benefits on that, which is about 30 to 40% of what the salary is. So if you have multiple 50% positions, it's just inefficient because you're paying the benefits multiple times. And that's also the area where the cost is increasing. So what we thought was, the goal was, we're going to have 2 positions that work across the resource centers, which is a big shift. But we're going to make those positions exempt so that there's more flexibility in the hours. We're not accruing the liability of comp time and overtime and that type of stuff. It's a higher level position than and they would be full-time, so we're paying the benefits twice instead of 6 times. And then we brought back a position that we had, but it was unfilled, which was the office manager position, to try to consolidate as many administrative functions. I think the first step when we finalized on this model was to go and hire the unfilled vacancies for the director positions. That was step 1. We did move into the layoff mode. We did try to build in some transition of program coordinator time. So some units had already also started without a program coordinator and just working with students. And some of them had been doing it for quite some time. I don't know how long, Rosie, you've been doing it for like 2 years?
3 years.
3 years. So it's not like this is an untested model of having students. The other benefit of this model is we were creating 30 work study positions, or 36 work study positions. There's a little bit of a delayed effect on that for this year because as we did layoffs, we also had to pay severances, vacation payouts, and so we have some one-time costs this year that we won't have next year. Some program coordinators, I think one may have left on their own, and then we did move in to a layoff process with respect to the other program coordinators. We did retain somebody who's working across 2 resource centers for some transition support. I in no way want to say this model or what we're doing right now is exactly the same as what we had before. It's not, it's different. I do think this preserves the objectives of the resource center while bringing our budget pressures down. And it also builds in more money, it gives you more availability for programming money. That's been another challenging area for the resource centers. So let me stop there because I know I've thrown out a lot of different information. I don't know if any of my colleagues, does anyone else want to add anything to what I've covered, please? Or anything I got wrong or didn't clarify?
Well, I think it's important that, and Nancy helped me with this because I think you and I both have been, and Deb, have been here to see multiple budget cuts. So the CARE measure that students initiated was a response to another previous budget cut. And I know I can speak for El Centro, we lost SFAC money that had been there for specific projects. I had just been on the job, I think, a couple of years and went into shock because we went from $25,000 in programming money to $8,000 for the entire year in programming monies. And so there's been multiple ways, and correct me if I'm wrong again, we were originally not on Measure 7 as staff. Was that not Francisco?
This
Yeah.
20,000 fund, right?
Yeah, so there was another effort a long time, well, not a long time ago, but it's been a while, where the former Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs, in an effort to protect us, moved us from state monies, which were being affected by a budget cut, put us on Measure 7, and then lo and behold, double whammy, right? So the budget stressors have been there for a long time.
I'm sorry, no, please.
And I was just gonna also add, the office manager program assistant position, that was originally, kind of an analyst position specifically for the ethnic resource centers, and now is supporting resource centers as well. And then there's an operational cost for the ethnic resource centers that we contribute to, the ethnic resource center units contribute to as well. Yeah, so just a little bit more.
I mean, quite honestly, we were trying to protect against doing this for a period of time, but it caught up with us. And I think after the change with the benefits piece as well, it only made it harder to not end in a deficit. And all these years, everybody's ended their budgets balanced. We haven't faced a deficit or a major deficit. A couple other points in terms of student consultation, because I know one of the questions I got from an earlier group is, who did you talk to or what students did you talk to? And remember, this was over a period of a few years. And so I also don't want to assume that what students wanted 3 years ago is still what you guys want today. And so definitely, if our core assumptions or core functions are off or we need to add something, please, this is definitely, I'm open to hearing that. The other student consultation we did is we did go to the SUA General Assembly at the time that we were doing the focus groups, just to say, take it back to your colleges and to bring feedback back. We also, because when the Student Fee Advisory Committee was reviewing all the funding, we did do a presentation, Carolyn and I, and we presented the current organizational model that if we kept on course, we were predicting about a $50,000 deficit. And then we did a realignment model, which we presented to that student group, which was one of the options, one of the 15, but it was one of the ones that made it towards the end. And that had no layoffs of program coordinators, but it had them reassigned. And then we had it didn't create the student positions though. And then we had one that was creating the SAO3s, laying off the program coordinators, and then investing that money in work-study positions. The other benefit of the work-study was you had an added, you're basically almost doubling your money of students by getting the work-study. The problem with the work-study model is that people don't always get enough money to cover them for the year. Once somebody's trained, you become really good at it. It presents operational challenges for the directors. Without, and I don't want to mask this, without question, this job is going to be harder on the directors than it was before. I've never, I want to acknowledge that. It's not unique to the resource center directors. A lot of staff are taking on multiple roles at this time. And then we also did ask the Student Fee Advisory Committee if they were willing to vote on putting a cost increase for Measure 7 on the ballot for this cycle. And they voted down no, not because they don't care about Measure 7, but because they said, you guys cannot keep coming to us and asking us to solve your problems, especially when it's going to be to pay for benefits and retirements. Like, you cannot just balance everything on the backs of students. So our fees are already really high. In fact, we're going to review how people are utilizing their money on fees now. So I think the climate was not great. There was one effort from some students recently that were getting information to try to fund the program coordinator position. That never made it to ballot, but I think from the last time it was brought up, I think maybe the mood has changed. Maybe this is the right time to do that. But we cannot continue just to balance our increased costs by saying, okay, now give us more money, now give us more money. And what's different about doing a referendum now is when we did Measure 7, you got 100% of the money that you produced. Now the measures have what's called a return to aid. So to try to help students who are in financial aid, a third of what you collect from the revenue goes to financial aid. So you only get 2/3 of what you produce. And so, you know, I'm not, it's up to you all. If you think a ballot measure is a good idea, we certainly will support it. We're also committed to making this work with the money that we have. But it has not been easy on anybody. I think clearly augmenting our services or augmenting resources is a much more exhilarating process. But it is a reality that we do have to, you know, contend with. So I'm going to really stop there because I know we've thrown out a lot. And then just ask questions, any comments, feedbacks, even if you're anything.
Pablo, I have a question.
Yeah.
Was it calculated how much an additional referendum would need to be in order to stop the leakage? If we had the old model, to sustain the old model, and I understand there, you know, those increased benefit costs, I'm thinking if that was a new measure, it would only need to be a one-time measure because it would build into it the incremental increases that was left out of the original Measure 7. How much per student would we be talking about that they would need to vote on?
You know, I don't know the answer to that. I know that I think it can be calculated. Part of the challenge is that the numbers, predicting what the future costs, you know, I mean, it has to be enough to cover the rise and increase in benefits costs, retirement, and also future cost of living increases. Because every time there's a merit or cost of living, we dip further into the non-salary money.
Right, so I'm just thinking off the top of my head, if it's about $6 per student per quarter, is that what you're saying it is currently?
I believe so.
I
We
think
can
it
look
was
it up.
40, I think it was actually quite
Do you have access to online?
Yeah.
We can look it up right now. So now we have the thing of the return to aid, but, and I mean, we
I'm
can
just
calculate
thinking
that number,
If that
Melody can
figure
calculate it.
funded everything before and it was that amount, it sounds like it wouldn't be that much more to close that gap in a permanent way.
Stephanie says it's $51.
For the year. For the
quarter.
year, okay.
For
For
the
the quarter,
quarter.
$51, okay,
Yeah.
that $51 is big.
For the resource?
Yeah, no, it covered a lot of stuff. It covered
Yeah.
student life programming, covered core council, covered graduate students, covered HIV prevention education.
So there's a whole under that funding category.
The Student Fee Advisory Committee did get an allocation from the EDC of permanent and one-time monies. We did apply to get $60,000 for one of the things that they said is, we want to fund programs. Don't bring us mandated costs like health or benefits costs and cost increases. We whatever money we're gonna invest, we wanna see a direct connection to a program or a new service. So, we did request funding for, the student positions, have more student positions, to grow that piece. But that, it wasn't the right time to request permanent staffing positions, in my opinion. And I think some people may have requested those, I don't think they're gonna be successful. It didn't match the criteria of what they said they were looking for. And there were two pots of money. They had one-time monies, and they had permanent monies, and the one-time pot was much bigger. So we figured if we can solidify the student salary piece, which those costs don't face the same cost increases, because people don't get benefits for retirement for being a student staff. Yes.
Going off what you said about the students' expectations of what the directors and the program assistants would do, the two most conflicting are that the students want a physical presence, that when they walk into the research center they have professional staff which is taught. However, there's also apparently a need that the directors will go out and do education in other systems on campus. For instance, as you brought up, that works with counseling and psychological services. With the new model that you proposed, there's just an impossibility of a physical presence. So, of those two, is it possible to reduce something for the director so that one or the other need can be met more?
Well, I would say definitely, to me, there's a hierarchy in that, and there's priorities. So the physical presence and being involved with the students is the first priority. I would leave it to the discretion of the directors to say, well, they might say, well, I'm going to invest, 16 hours in a series of meetings, which means the center will be covered for about 2 days with students. But because I'm going to make a difference that will be ongoing, it's worth it. I mean, they're going to have to evaluate. We don't go in and say, how many meetings are you in today, Stephanie, or how many students have you seen? But I think clearly the priority is to be available for students in-house. We have asked the directors, and this is difficult because they can't, be in two places, as possible to reduce the number of meetings that they have and to try to be as available as possible. It's easier to say than it is to do. But I would say the education piece, the primary responsibility that rests with the Office of Diversity Inclusion in terms of training, that's not their primary duty. But I think that they happen to have some cultural competence and capacity to teach. So I would say that's more icing on the cake, but the core is being available for students. And I think that's where they spend most of their time. But I definitely, I think it's also hard too. I mean, they do have to go to some meetings, and they will get sick and do need to be out. And so the coverage, coverage with students is challenging. I think a lot of it is based upon training students, having a quality control process. Working with students, there's just like staff, there's a real variety. There's some students who need very little supervision, and there's some students who need a lot of close supervision. So, but in this particular year, it's even been more challenging because we're still facing some costs from the layoffs that we did that were one-time costs that next year we won't have. So everybody's budgets is really tight this year because of those additional one-time costs. But maybe we should, unless there's any other questions, can we just check the list of if we covered the stuff we said we covered?
Let's see, maybe this kind of gets back to what was asked right now. How will there be a continuity of services given that the PCs are no longer at each center? So that was one.
Why don't we just take one at a time, if that's okay? So that's going to be tough. Without question, the program coordinators made a significant, contribution. Each center is different. An organizational model is kind of meant to be broad, so we're not going into saying, specifically who's going to do what. We are, part of it, this is banking on the idea that there's 2 SAO3s, which of course students will be involved in helping to select those positions, that we can hopefully leverage whatever it is that they do, that they work across the centers. So we're kind of banking on removing some duplication and hoping there will be a return on that. It's difficult to say until we try it out. I think we have tested the student model, and I'm not in any way devaluing the program coordinators, but I don't think we've seen a significant underperformance or underperformance at all from the centers that had program coordinators during this time versus those that did not. And the work of each center is different too. I don't want to lump them all together. There are definitely differences in size of population, complexity of issues, quite a wide range. So I don't mean to simplify it, but it is definitely banking on that where we're trying to fill in the gap a little bit for the program creators is with students, and then trying to pull out some of the functions with these two higher level SEO3s.
Pablo, can I add
Yes.
something? You know, in this transition, we're also trying different operational systems. So, for example, we're doing a little bit more online, using like Asana and Google Docs, and to share and communicate with each other, and that's been helping. We are seeing some changes in terms of certain decisions or prioritizing programs or services. For example, our printed newsletter has gone online and it's not as frequent anymore. But we're, committed to producing, providing, program quality of programs. Maybe not as frequent, but still quality of programs and services.
And I think one of this isn't necessarily directly related to the organizational model, but I think one thing we've been working on for the past few years is to try to establish more equity across the resource centers in terms of performance. That was a pretty significant issue, particularly during the time that we didn't have a full-time director, that we didn't have a director in the ARC and the African American Resource Center. So that's in one area. The other one of the benefits is, things continue to change and evolve, and so for example, if we lose a director, we're in a position budgetarily without question to replace that position. So it's not, if a vacancy does come up, not that I want one, coming up by any means, don't anybody go anywhere, but whereas I think if we had the budget pressures before, that would be a question. But I think that we cemented that through this model. There's been trade-offs, I guess. What was our second issue? Can you review?
The second question was, what are the differences between the old PC model and the new positions that are being proposed?
Okay. So I think we covered that, but I want to put it back to the folks who asked that question, or anybody else, if we think we addressed that adequately, or you have some other insights or thoughts, or please, agreement, disagreement, yes?
I think it would help me if you went, Pablo, perhaps more in depth as to what you foresee the SAO3 positions actually entailing.
I'm going to Carolyn's been working on the job description, so I'm going to, do you mind taking that? Well, you could, but maybe just kind of describe it?
Well, initially, we were trying to we met at a director's retreat in the beginning, the early fall, late summer, and came up with job descriptions that, again, still retain the directors still retain the autonomy for each center, but then these two positions conceivably could move in between all of the centers and provide marketing support for all of the centers, web-based support. We had initially looked at perhaps one being, or them being functional area driven. So like I said, one of them doing web-based, one of them doing newsletter marketing, that type of, and the other one doing more student programming, program development, program planning. And then as we met and as we went through the reorganization, we felt that these positions should be the same position, so these two positions could theoretically move between all of the centers. And so, but still maintaining, some sense of, these folks being people that could move between the 6 centers. And so, so that's where it was. And then as we've sent these positions to staff HR to get them posted, to get them classified, they've been sending them back to us feeling as though we really kind of took out the student affairs sort of professional aspect, the student interaction part of it. And so we've had to go back in and add a lot more student interaction in for those positions. And that's kind of what's taking a long time, because we're really arguing with classification, meaning staff HR kind of arguing with them back and forth, because and I'm just gonna say it, because I've said it to many of you, that I really don't get the sense that they know what we do. That they really know the student affairs officer position well enough to be able to know what it is exactly that we do. And so we've really had to kind of be able to create these new positions that had that expertise, that had that marketing, that had that web development piece, but then also had the professional aspect in terms of the professional development, the student development piece, the student identity development, the student affairs piece, getting everybody, the retention services piece, getting everybody, once we get you guys all here, we gotta get you through here, and we gotta get you to finish, and we gotta get you to graduate. And so, I think that's the piece that we had to go back in and really boost that piece, but again,
We're behind
they
our
don't really,
timeline.
so we're behind our timeline because I get the sense that they don't really understand what it is that we do. And so that's where we are now. So we've had to really kind of create these new positions, go from something that was very specific to something a little bit more specific, to something a little bit more specific, but then back to something very general. And so that's what these positions are newly created. So there's nothing really at any of the other UC campuses that this position looks like. And so we're having to, again,
And most
recreate.
of the positions where people do programs and activities are classified lower, so I think it's a new concept. I think there has to be enough independence and scope for the job to be classified as the 3 level. And so we're dealing with that. The other aspect about this model that I'm hoping for us to see is that clearly there's going to be more interdependence amongst the centers operationally, not in terms of deciding what they program, but my hope is that will also increase the collaboration. Not to say that they don't currently collaborate, but I think it would be good to have more collaboration. Also some more harmony. That's one of the things students have raised with me is tension between the resource centers, and it doesn't make sense if part of the mission is to be a resource center. So that's another area that we're working on. And yeah, so that's other elements we're hoping to see. But it isn't, I don't want to, this is going to be somewhat of an experiment. And if we get it wrong, tell us, I think the people selected in those roles are going to make a big difference, even if, especially coming into a new job. If we get strong people, they're going to make it work, and if we don't get strong people. So clearly we're committed to student input into the hiring process and on the search committee. Carolyn is helping to launch that process. So for people that are interested in having a stake in that and can make the time, we'll definitely have, forums and a way of connecting, providing feedback on the candidates.
So I'm more concerned about the quality of the service we're going to be getting, because 2 people for 6 centers, how am I going to have to know who they are, or are I going to know who's going to cater to which services? Because the African Resource Center might require these services, and they might know about it, or the Cantu might require these services, they might not know about LGBTI issues. So and you mentioned how you created the student positions. That's great, but we have to remember that we're here to get our degree, not to work. And I know that it's good because it's cheaper, but in the long run, I don't feel like I'm getting the quality that I'm paying of education or experience that I'm paying to come here. I just feel like I'm not getting what I'm paying to.
And I think you're pointing out one of the trade-offs of this model is it is probably going to be, and you guys chime in if you tell me I'm off, but I think it is going to be a little bit, there'll be less personalized, a sense of less personalization versus when you've got another staff member, even if they're part-time, there that you see all the time. And I'm not going to try to say that this model is something that it isn't. I think that's something we are facing. And if there was a way to keep the positions in place, or to have 2 or 3, or the level that should be in place, I would be the first one to say let's do it. So I don't want to. I don't want to pretend and say it's going to be the same. I don't know that for sure. And my guess is it probably will be. I know the director is going to make every effort to know everybody and stay connected to folks. But I think you pointed out a really good flaw or trade-off of this model.
I've been through this because in my community college we had a multicultural center, and we had one program coordinator for everything, for African American Resource Center, for the queer center, and he was queer, but he was not African American, he was not Asian Pacific. So it was an issue overall, like, and when people got clustered in that center, it was just one room, and you need your place to go and be yourself. You can't just have, because if I don't see somebody I identify with, I'm not gonna go and be like, hey, this is what I want to do. This is my event I want to do. It's I think it's just a flaw right there.
Yeah, no, I acknowledge that and definitely agree on that.
I mean, and I think, Manny, it would be awesome if we had, like, a queer, multiracial person in that position. That would be, that would really be ideal. And I think this is not the ideal situation for any of us. I mean, none of us want to be in the position where, you're not able to provide the services that the students deserve. I mean, that's, the bottom line. I don't think any of us want to, and I did not want to be the person that came in and laid people off, because that's not who, what I want to do. But I think on some level, we have to really address this reality of these rising costs, but still be able to provide services for students. And you're right, you guys are paying for this. This is what the previous students had voted on, and this is the centers that the previous students wanted to create. And we're under fire. I mean, the whole campus is under fire. It's not just us. It feels like us because we're smaller. We have no ethnic studies. It feels like we're especially under fire. But I mean, you have to look at it from the perspective of, so you have, okay, and I'm just gonna put my academic hat on. So I went to school, I got my PhD in ethnic studies. I taught general ethnic studies for many, many, many years before I had my PhD. So, I could never speak to certain experiences that I had never experienced, but I was still a woman of color teaching this coursework. And so you look at it, that could be the analogy for these positions coming in. They may not have a certain cultural or racial or sexual expertise, that's a terrible thing to say, but that are gendered expertise, but they will have some knowledge coming in to be able to offer that expertise. And if they don't know, they're going to be the first ones to say, talk to Stephanie, talk to Deb, talk to Nancy, talk to Rosie, talk to Dr. Marla, talk to Carolyn. They're going to be the first ones to do that. But I would hope that we would be able to find someone, and that's my goal, to find someone that has the well-rounded educational background and the practical background to be able to play a certain role for you guys and then be able to refer you on to someone else.
Yes.
So you talked a lot about how one of the problems was that Measure 7 didn't account for inflation, and so you had the problem where the cost of the program directors was increasing, but the budget wasn't increasing. So how is that not going to be a problem with the new program coordinators? Because eventually their salaries and stuff are going to increase, but the budget won't increase with that.
It's a really good question. Well, first of all, like I said, the salaries you pay on every FTE, every staff member, once you hit 0.50, you pay the 40% amount. So the fact that we went from 6 to 2 right there cuts a significant amount. And so we're putting more salary and more FTE into that benefits, because you pay the benefits, when you create the FTE. And so it's a more efficient model. Eventually, yeah, if the salaries, at some point, if we do nothing down the line, we'll have this issue again. But I think our hope was, there's two things that happened. This last year, we had a one-time cut of all Measure 7 areas. And that cut is paid for 3 years of this leakage issue. Basically, what the Dean of Students Office did is they said, okay, we're going to look at everybody's carry forward at the end of as of June 30th, and we're going to take 75% of everybody's carry forward. And when they scooped that money, they paid across all the, not just the resource centers, across all the areas, OPERS, retention services, health services, and that scooped enough money to buy us 3 years worth of time. So we're trying to address it on a year-by-year basis, and we're also hoping that as the budget gets better, we can reinvest some money in this direction as well. There's one other thing that we did. Rosie mentioned before about fund swaps, or they're called fund swaps. when you move, you don't change the dollar amount, but you change the type of money. So if you're expecting a cut on state funding, you move over to Measure 7 to avoid the cut. And so one thing we did is we got about half the salaries onto what's called student services fee money. Because student services fee money is, when you have a salary and you have a cost increase, you get budget for that. So it grows. It's not like the student referendum money. So we did move about half of the, so we took all the money, like in other units, health services gave a lot of money to the retention services, and we took their student services fee money that was programming costs, and we swapped it with the resource center salary. So basically, we reduced the leakage by putting more people onto this other fund. So we just swapped the money and put more staff on the money that grows. Does that make sense? So, but that didn't address the whole issue of the resource centers. I think we did it in a way where it won't adversely affect the other units, but it helps buy us some time. But anytime you have growing costs, I'm hopeful that, I think we've bought ourselves quite a bit of time with this shift, and I'm hopeful that we'll be at a point where we can make some investments back into this area, and not just be always cutting. Question here in the room, and here in the room? Yes.
Yeah. This is
Comment?
like less like mechanical, but more about like the causes, like the reason that you had to do this. It makes sense to me that you have to cut these positions, but the UC made, $6 million in profit in 2011. We got Prop 30. UC's, administration is retiring with hundreds of thousands of dollars in retirement every year. So it seems less a problem about budget and more about political will. Like, there's not enough power for more money, and that, hopefully that will change over time.
Well, and I think I would definitely use your voice. In terms of, I definitely think that asking the university in terms of other funding to be invested in this area, if it's a priority, for you, which I'm hearing that it is, definitely, share that with the Chancellor and the Executive Vice Chancellor, and I'm sure Alma's, willing to hear it. The scenarios we're talking about is within the existing money we have allocated to our area.
Right, that makes sense.
But I definitely think that this area is important. I'm not sure that everybody, it's a really key area. And I think as a campus, we definitely need to make more of an investment in this area, both inside the classroom in terms of ethnic studies and, as well as outside the classroom in terms of the resource centers. And I would welcome increased investment in this area. And I think it's an important message to convey. So I think on the totality of the UC system, it's not much of an argument to say there isn't the money, but I can tell you within the area of money that we have allocated. So I do think the problem is only going to be resolved by taking it outside of that.
And Prop 30 is a stopgap measure. It's not something that, okay, it passed, everybody breathes a sigh of relief. Well, that doesn't mean we can avoid our 6, 15, 25% cuts or whatever. It's still, people have to figure out who gets what money. And so that's not the end-all be-all answer.
And I think a real place of influence, because I think you're going to find that on the administration side, not just any sort of administrator, but I think there is the will to make an investment if we have the money to do it. Where I would emphasize some also to the academic senate has a lot of power in terms of these investments. There's a committee on planning and budget. There's a student representative on that committee. You should know who they are, and they should know what your priorities are, so they can represent that to the Committee on Planning and Budget. They're very influential. Now, they're a body that advises the Executive Vice Chancellor and the Chancellor, but they hold a lot of policy control. So I definitely think you should be talking to your faculty to talk about we did have some new money in the UC system as a result of what the Chancellor called rebenching, where they basically, for every tuition dollar that comes in, it gets split up and each UC gets a different percentage. And so based on a formula, we would get I think 70 cents off the dollar, and UCLA would get 90 cents. And so they redid the formula. That's what's called rebenching. Chancellor's talked a lot about this. And now we're getting instead of 70, these aren't exact figures, we're getting 80 cents. And all that money got invested, I think, into 16 or 18 faculty positions. for new faculty hires. And so if you think those investments should come to the resource centers or whatever service, you should definitely, there is new money coming in. I'm not saying it's enough. I'm not saying that this is more important than faculty positions. I'm just saying that if that's your key priority, you need to let the academic senate know as well as the committee on planning and budget, because they have a lot of influence in that process. There was a hand here and then here. Yes, here and then here.
It seems like for the most part, the kind of way we're talking about raising additional funds is through a student referendum. And there's other referendums I know that are gonna be on with regards to raising student fees. I think the library this year, not this year, the next year, needs to once again ask for an extension of a student fee that's been in place for a couple of years. Otherwise, they have really massive contractions in the amount of service that they can offer. And I think in the past, there's definitely been a will on the part of students to be able to fund these resources that they really get a lot out of. But given how tough times are, with all these other fees that we have to pay to go here, I worry whether or not students will vote for multiple fees that will hurt themselves. And so I'm wondering if there is any conversation about alternative ways to raise funding that wouldn't just rely on us as students, but start to tap into the money that the university as a whole definitely has. And how can we start that conversation?
And it's definitely a question we had to ask ourselves. Clearly, employment is important, but our service to students and making sure it is, a priority. We took a tough road in doing this. It was not easy to take some of the actions that we had to do, but we also couldn't just avoid them and say, okay, we'll pay for them down the line, or we'll charge them back to the students. We're going to have to, try to preserve the best of what we have in terms of the services and reduce our costs, and it's definitely not easy. There was a hand there and then here. I think I think you had your hand up first.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then.
So the Student Fee Advisory Committee only voiced support for the restructuring model when compared to the reassignment model. And they raised a lot of concerns, such as that the programs coordinators are the positions that most work with students, and that those are being cut, and that students, for the most part, want cuts from the top, not the bottom, and then that SFAC and SUA are not widely representative of our diverse student body. And I was wondering how, in your restructuring model, you address these concerns.
Not yet, but we'll see you then.
I don't think we ever went out to students to poll on which position was a high priority for them. We did, it's not something that we asked, because I think when we met with the staff, we committed to, we felt like if we didn't have the director position, we were then basically going to a multicultural center model. And some of you were around for this conversation. But I guess I want to ask, do you think we got it wrong, or do you think that the priority should have been on the program coordinator positions?
Well, I was just wondering, because these are major concerns that, I agree with, and that SFAC, which signed off on this model, raised, and
Well, I think what SFAC said is, we don't really like any of this, but we think this is the better, bite the bullet and just do it, do the thing that's gonna save the most. But I think without question, across the board, including us, didn't want to go into a cost savings measure. We would much rather be allocating money and expanding services and, contracting them. But they basically said, you can't pin this on us, you gotta do more, you've done some student consultation. And there's also kind of two differences in the student consultation we did. We felt there were high users of the resource centers and then low users of the resource centers. And we kind of felt, okay, we gotta address both, because everybody's paying into it, but the way that we tried to focus on a more diverse constituency was by doing the focus groups within the resource center teams. So they held their own focus groups in addition to the consultation with SFAC, and that was a way of trying to cross some of it. It was a question though, advice whether if you use a service, if you're an intern, it's a very different experience than if you maybe went to one event the whole year. So it was a hard thing to balance, and that's why we thought, okay, if we go to the representative government bodies, that's kind of the official protocol, and they are a representative body, but then we'll also try to address it from the interns as well. But it was definitely tough. Even when we discussed it as a staff, I don't think we were devaluing the program coordinator position. We just felt like in order to keep true, to not further dilute what we have in place, we need to keep to this, this model. But, I don't, does anyone else want to add to that?
I don't know, and this, you know, I've only been here 2 years, so I can't really, you know, and in my observation and being in the ERCs, you know, on the 3rd floor of Bacon Building, I think that, the directors are as engaged, you know, if not equally or more than the program coordinators. So, but that's kind of the struggle of the position, because the director position is, you know, there's a whole policy issue, like a campus-wide policy issue. There, we're supposed to be representing, you know, the voice of the, you know, our respective students and our constituencies. But at the same time, you know, you have to figure out how to juggle doing that and being in the office and seeing students that come in and dealing with you know, drama and dealing with all the other stuff and programming and making sure that someone has a car to go pick, you know, I mean, we all wear many different hats. And so, you know, other folks have said, you know, outside at least of the students that I see on a daily basis, other folks have said, you know, previously, and some coordinators have really kind of been the focus for the students, or their position was more student-centered. But I think that now, as you know, as things have changed, I mean, I think that that's changed, and I think that it's always kind of been the same too. That there still is that level of you know, of professional development that the students are getting from the directors as well. And so, and that, you know, I mean, we all have families, and we're here, you know, we're here, and we all, you know, have other lives going on, but we're here evenings, weekends, you know, I mean, the program coordinators were, and continue to be too. But I just, you know, I want that to, you know, to want us all to understand that even though there is that, you know, that level of expertise at the director level, the directors are still programmers, the directors are still very active and kind of, you know, on the ground with the students. And so I want, you know, and that is what I've observed in the 2 years that I've been here, and what I do as a director myself, as the director of two spaces, and as a faculty member.
The other piece too, I would say, is that maybe the title director is a little bit of a misnomer in the sense that if you think of somebody who's just telling people what to do and sitting behind a desk, and that's never been the role of our division. If you walk into the DRC, you're going to see the director meeting with students. If you walk into, I meet with students at it is right now a time where it's all hands on deck, and so the director should be accessible to you all. I mean, I know that they can't reproduce themselves in multiple places, but the notion is we are saying, yeah, we got to figure out how to make them more accessible, but many of them already were. I don't want to minimize the fact that, like the earlier issue that was raised about, there's going to be less personal attention from staff. Yeah, there's just fewer people. These 2 people are going to be running around. I don't know how much contact we'll have, and totally acknowledge that's a big flaw in the model. But I also want to make it that the directors, part of the idea of consolidating some of these functions with these 2 people is to release the directors as much as possible. My other fear with the model, quite honestly, is like the directors, we have people who've been with us for a while, and like, we might lose people because it's not the level of support that they've been engaged. That's another flaw in the model. You know, people, you come because you're satisfied with what you're doing, you care about the job. Obviously compensation matters to people, that's not a bad thing, but also for staff support. You know, that's another perk, and so, and we're making their job even harder. So I'm very concerned about, not just with their role, but overall, we're doing that a lot to people overall. And I want to acknowledge that. That's an issue, so. But there was a hand here, I'm sorry.
So, have these job positions been posted and has anyone applied yet? Also, how long is it expected to take for these positions to be filled and functional? And how do you explain not having the program directors for almost a year?
The program coordinator position? Okay. Good, those are all very good questions. First of all, we had to wait to, when you end a position, you have to pay, when you separate somebody, you have to pay the vacation out, and you have to pay severance, so you get money for the number of years of service that you had. And so what we had to do in balancing the numbers is we had to figure out that information, and then if we would have started somebody like right away, we would have ended in a deficit because of the accumulated, the one-time costs. So we waited, but then the other hitch we ran into is the job descriptions. So what you do is you write a job description, you send it to staff HR, they classify it, and then it gets posted. And we've been in probably at least a 2-month, if not more, delay with with staff HR, because they said this is an SAO3 position. First it was an SAO1, now we have it up to an SAO2, and we feel like in order to attract a competitive group of people, it needs to be a higher level position. Plus, we want to make it exempt. That's another budgetary savings. It sounds a little counterintuitive. You're going to make the position higher level, but it saves you money because you work until your work is done. There's no, come in on a Saturday. It's not additional compensation. So it's actually it's cheaper to pay somebody a little bit more base salary, but then not accrue the liability of comp time, overtime, those types of things. I would say we're right now, we're at the end of January. I would say by mid-February, the job should be posted at the very latest. I think we're gonna do a 4-week posting because we're gonna do some advertising, and we need to have, the advertising has to be in effect while the job is posted, and then there's something that's called an initial review date. So if it posts by February 15th, it'll close around March 15th. And so right around that time frame, we usually get access to the applications that met the initial review date. So it stays open, but the initial batch of group that applies, probably then by the end of March, we would be doing an initial review, forming a committee with student representation, certainly from SUA, but also from the different resource centers. And then we would need to select for interview. That process is probably at least a 2-month process, just going through. If the pool is really good and we're able to make an offer and somebody accepts, that could be a 2 to 3 month process. Sometimes you go through that, and usually what we do is we invite them back for a student forum, so that we have additional, student input, and then we would go to make an offer. So it can take about, in a fast pace, 3 months, but it could be closer to 6 months. It could be closer to the end of the academic year that we have the positions filled. It just depends on those issues. Quality of the pool, how quickly the committee can form and move, and then that if you make an offer and then the person accepts or doesn't accept, then you go to your number 2, so that takes a little while. But I would say definitely we should try to move. We should be thorough but expeditious. There was a hand here and then here.
Going back to
Wait, I'm sorry, just real quick. Did I answer your question fully? I think there were multiple parts. And you can also say, you answered my question, but I'm not satisfied, it needs to be done by May. You took a year, now you're gonna take till the end of the academic year. I mean, feel comfortable giving me the feedback. I mean, I will work to try, but the better sense I have was what's required in protocol. We will alter our work plan to try to address those needs. I don't wanna forego like student input or have 2 people on the search committee and then just get hired in real quickly. I think we need to do, because of the importance of these positions, it needs to be thorough, but not take 2 years to hire somebody, not overdo it. So you said that was, did you have any other feedback or, no? Okay. Question here.
So why instead of going through all this trouble and trying to find somebody from outside, can we get somebody from here that already knows the position and the job, and create a new agreement with them and try to compromise.
Or reclassify it.
Yeah, but because it's a lot of, finding somebody else is gonna cost time and money, and it's gonna cause the quality of the services also. So might as well find somebody that already knows within the system.
We did explore those options in terms of with staff HR what we could do. In the end, I decided that I wanted to go out for a competitive process because I thought it would yield us the most possible options. It doesn't limit any current employees from applying, and we certainly are encouraging people to apply. But we felt that we needed to do a competitive process. That can also be beneficial for the person coming into the job, feeling like, okay, I competed and earned this position, but I had a lot of influence in this position, and I pushed very much that we go. I don't know if that was a group decision or if you guys want to weigh in on that at all, but I definitely felt it was important that we would be better off in the long run through an open competitive process. It doesn't preclude any current employees from applying.
And also too, we've also were advised by staff HR that it's very difficult to reclassify someone who's already in an SAO1 position to reclass them to an SAO3. It's very difficult to do that. And they have their processes, and sometimes that process might be more difficult than having someone come in, apply for that position rather than being reclassed.
I guess my question was Annie really asked it in some ways, but my understanding from talking with folks is that you could do an internal recruitment, which an internal, for you, those of you who know, that means eligible for campus-only members, and that if you didn't have strong enough candidates, then you could do an external recruitment. One of the things I've heard, for example, from Michelle Whittingham, is that with external recruitments in this salary range, it's very difficult because people are not aware of the cost of living in Santa Cruz. And so they either take the job and have a very difficult time being able to support themselves.
Michelle's not in staff HR.
No, I'm saying she's had many hires at this SAO 1, 2, 3 level, and they end up being offered the position, and then they start doing the research about the cost of living here, and they back out and they end up with an internal recruitment essentially, because people who are living here who have figured out how to live here.
Well, I mean, one of the questions almost said is find out what the students want. I mean, is that what you all want, an internal search and not do it? I was thinking it would give us the broadest options, but it's not for my benefit. I mean, I guess I definitely would, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what I heard you say is do an internal recruitment, don't do a competitive process.
A little more fair, and if you find nobody.
For both positions or one of the positions?
Well, for both. We want to keep people that know the job and people that know the students and then know the community here.
Okay. How do I mean, is there consensus on that, or what do other people think? Because I mean, I think we could possibly. I mean, my job was to bring back what you all wanted to Alma, so I'm hearing you very specific, loud and clear. I do want to get a sense if that's you or if it's a representative group of the students. So I guess I want to put that out for discussion, so I can give her that feedback.
I mean, how do other folks feel about that, is what Pablo was asking.
Yes.
For me, I feel, yes, I do agree on that, but at the same time, I just want to give an opportunity to go outside the space. I feel like sometimes we bring someone from outside the space, we get different perspectives and resources as well. And sometimes I feel that those are the things that we need at this school, at this university. So I don't know, I appreciate that the people inside this school could actually provide so many resources, but at the same time, I would like to see what others can actually bring to the table, because I feel this is the time that we need to be critical. So.
Okay. How about others? This is a really good point, because we could change the process.
Yes.
I'd be happy to talk to Alma. Yes.
True, but when you do that, you're taking someone's job that is pending this. So, yeah, do the general recruitment, see if somebody can apply for it, and try to give that person who's working already and knows the process. And if that person doesn't want to apply for it or doesn't want it, good, then you move into our outside recruitment. And then you get somebody else in.
I think one thing to keep in mind is that the positions are going to be different. Like the job description is going to be different than what the program coordinators were. The responsibilities will be different, their roles. I don't remember, I don't think the directors were involved in the actual decision of how the recruitment was going to happen, but in terms of my personal opinion, I think the positions are going to be different. And then also keeping in mind that UC Santa Cruz's campus is one of the least ethnically diverse staff of the UC, so
an external search?
I would, yes, because the positions are different and we would recruit, that it would be a very competitive, pool.
Yeah. So, can we just hear from some other, did you wanna comment again? And then I really would like to hear from other folks. This is not an easy thing, but I wanna be able to tell my boss, talk with the students about this specific issue, and here's where they stand.
Just one more thing. I mean, internal recruitment doesn't work. What I was really saying is that we should talk to the program coordinators and be like, we're gonna create these 2 positions. Pretty much just bargain. Who wants this position? Who wants to apply for it? Let's compromise. We make an agreement and pick the ones that are best fit for it. Because honestly, we're just going here to. I feel like we should be to the program coordinators, and it's their choice to compromise with whoever's in the way they want. That's it, the way I feel.
Okay. Others? Yes.
Yeah, I'd put forward that I'd say it's a disservice to the students to not draw from the most the greatest talent pool available. I guess a follow-up question to that is, if we were hiring internally, is there some type of merit, like bonus or something with internal?
We're talking about slightly different things. I appreciate your feedback. So there's something that's called the reclassification process where you promote somebody within a unit. This is not within the same unit. So we only currently have just one program coordinator currently employed. So it would only be open to one person of people who had filled the job. So everyone else is no longer here. Either that's on their own or they were laid off. So, and reclassification is within the unit. So if that person worked at the Women's Center or wherever, it'd be within that. This is taking it out of the resource and putting it's technically in the unit of the ERC, but they're gonna work across all 6 of the resource centers. So I don't know if even reclassification is an option. The other option is to do an internal recruitment, which says only UCSC employees can apply for this job. Doesn't matter what level you are, it doesn't give priority to the people previously employed. If you were a UCSC employee, by the time the job is advertised, and external people can't apply. And then the third is an external recruitment, basically you publicize widely. It's open to internal people who were laid off from this job. Current employees can all apply for it. And maybe one thing I would offer, and this is the way I was thinking about it, is I really feel, and this is nothing to the staff, I'm a staff member myself, but our first priority is not employment of current employees. I mean, we'd like to preserve employment, but we really have to get the best possible people. Now, if somebody currently employed on this campus is the best possible person, they're gonna rise to the top anyways. And it's not even gonna be because of cost of living, it's because they're the most uniquely qualified to do this job. And I'm more than open to coach, support, do an information session for previous program coordinators to make sure they have the strongest chances to compete for the job. But I think I think that that allows, it keeps the pool open, but also sends a message to the previously and current employees like, we're encouraging you to apply to this job. And so, I mean, I've done career coaching with all kinds of people and their employees within retention services. I'd definitely be more than willing to do an information session. And I'm not going to be part of the search committee. I will probably have a concurrence on the decision, but generally people who are part of the search committee can't coach somebody who's applying for it. That's why I'm saying I could do that. But I like the idea of promoting this and making sure that current employees have the best possible chance, but I would still leave. I mean, that's my personal opinion, but how do others feel? I mean, I know it's a touchy issue, but I want to caution, as investors, as the people who are funding this, that you want to get the best possible person and not feel committed to us as employment obligations. And strong people they have job mobility. They'll either rise to the top in this search, or they will find another better opportunity as well. Other comments, feedback? Any of the staff or directors? Rocio, did you have any comments on this?
Yeah, I wanted to say a few quick things. I think I'm really confident that Pablo and the directors have the best interest of students in mind. I think they are being placed in really difficult situations. And I'm interested in continuing this conversation. As we said earlier, this is just the beginning something. There was a lot of uncertainty of how the process was going, and just like this was informative and a chance to answer questions. And I think the larger issue a lot is that our university, in my opinion, lacks a strong enough commitment to diversity, and it's evident in the fact that we're paying for most of our services. And I think he left, but I'll talk to him later. But I like his comment that maybe it is time that we seek alternative options of demanding services for ourselves in the right places. And I'm interested in continuing this conversation and continuing further actions or further dialogue on like how to go about this. But like I said, I'm confident and I'm grateful that you all like spend time to come to us and talk to us, and like that I'm confident that you have the best interest of us in mind. But I think it's something that we can continue.
And I would encourage you along those lines, just one actionable step from that. I think the message of saying we're tired of the budget being balanced on our backs is an important message, but do it in the right place.
Yeah.
So where the policy issue is Committee on Planning and Budget. So the way the university works, it's based upon a consultation model where the academic senate provides the policy direction and the administration implements. And they're supposed to talk to each other through a consultation process to make major decisions. If you tell us, or you're at the resource center telling them, I mean, our opinion counts, but we're not a part of that process. So I highly recommend you talk to your faculty, tenured faculty that sit on those committees, and there's no, Rocio, maybe you take a delegation of students to the Committee on Planning and Budget and just say, we're just here to tell you you can't continue to balance the budget on our backs. I don't think that's their intent, but I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that is, I think, important to say. And also, by the way, the resource centers are a key priority area, so keep them in mind or give them more funding.
And I think as students, we're in a really unique position that we don't have our jobs at stake in here, and we're paying to be here. We have a lot of we're entitled to like demand our services and to demand to be given the right resources on our campus. And so I think like.
And there's a student seat. There's a committee on committees. There's one or two student seats on that committee. You should know who they are, and you should definitely let them know how you feel. If not, go yourself. They have a packed agenda, and there's a process for getting on the agenda, so it's not like you can just walk in and voice your concerns. You can write a letter. It gets recorded officially in the. But I definitely would say find out who your student reps are for the Committee on Planning and Budget, and any other key committee on affirmative action and diversity. They also have a voice into the academic senate. I think of one of their key committees. If it's a curricular issue, the Committee on Teaching. But I think the two big ones are Committee on Planning and Budget and Committee on Affirmative Action and Diversity. And I think you're going to find a lot of very like-minded faculty. Rosie?
I just want to say this is, I think, for me personally, and I'm going to say this on behalf of the directors, but if I'm incorrect, you can clarify. This is the hardest thing on a daily basis that we contend with. We always have this foremost in our minds, both in terms of, our personal and political feelings about what's going on, and yet at the same time, being highly, highly committed to the bottom line is services have to be delivered to you all as students. We're trying our absolute best to maintain that and to try to honor what you're paying for, but I want you to know it's painful for all of us, and that I want to do the pitch on your voice, because I think, I've been here a long time, and what I keep hearing over and over again is that people are not hearing your voices. Either there isn't active participation in surveys, like right now, there's a survey on campus climate. You all need to be taking those surveys and letting everybody in your student orgs and your classes know, fill that stuff out. Because that's what they go back to. They go back to where are the voices coming from, and that they're not simply just anecdotal, oh, I had a talk with one person. But this is what this concentration of student, voices have to say. And we were at a meeting yesterday, and they think a high result is 30% of the student body participating. Come on, we can do that. We can do that, and to really let people know, because even the faculty that are on these committees, they have, the ones that are committed to diversity, they need us to back them up through your voices, you know, so, it's this negotiation of anger and being pissed off that we're here at this location, and at the same time, we have a responsibility to making sure you get served, and you have a responsibility to make sure that the people that come after you have the services there. Cause once you leave, your knowledge base is gonna be gone. So where's the next, you know, we don't wanna have to keep going through this over and over again. So we recognize we're in this budget crunch, but you used a term, or I forget who used the term, reinvesting. Okay, so if we've gotta go through this painful location, where is the commitment to reinvest in real ways to diversity?
Any other, comments or feedback, thoughts?
Fill out the survey.
Survey.ucsc.edu.
Well, I definitely wanna thank everybody for coming out, and I'm happy to stick around and talk to you, if anybody wanna talk about something they didn't wanna say in an open group, or you wanna write